Welcome to The Last Climb. I'm Alex, and today we're looking into a K2 expedition where 4 women attempted a fully unsupported ascent without Sherpa assistance. It removed key support systems early, no Sherpas, no pacing structure, and higher up, small delays at rope sections and rest stops just kept stacking without anyone really adjusting. Knowing how it ended makes it hard to ignore how different things had already become from the plan. It was July 14th, 2016. At approximately 16,900 feet in the Karakoram Range, K2 Base Camp sat under clear, high-altitude conditions, with stable weather and low wind marking the start of a narrow summit window. The air was thin and cold, and visibility extended across surrounding glacier and rock systems under steady morning light. 4 women prepared to begin a summit attempt from base camp on K2 in Gilgit-Baltistan, Pakistan, operating as an unsupported team without Sherpa or high-altitude porter assistance as part of a planned self-sufficient ascent within a limited weather window. Sonia Vreeland, 41, a structural engineer from Denver, Colorado, organized the expedition and served as the primary decision-maker, motivated by a commitment to unsupported alpinism and cost-controlled logistics. Rachel Odom, 34, a physical education teacher from Montana, joined with prior high-altitude experience and a personal objective tied to a pledge fundraiser for ovarian cancer research in memory of her sister. Dana Forsyth, 29, a freelance photographer from Oregon, participated with the intent to document the climb while also pursuing experience at extreme altitude. Miriam Calloway, 38, a registered nurse from New Mexico, joined in a support role focused on group safety and basic medical response during the expedition. The team shared the objective of completing a self-supported ascent of K2 and returning within the duration of the forecasted stable weather period. K2 is the second highest mountain in the world, standing at 28,251 feet in the Karakoram Range between Pakistan and China. It's also known as one of the toughest and most dangerous mountains to climb, with steep walls, unpredictable weather, and a history of many climbers not making it back. The standard route, the Abruzzi Spur, ascends from base camp at approximately 16,900 feet through a series of established camps up to high camp at around 26,000 feet. Before the final summit push. Above high camp, climbers must pass through the bottleneck, a steep ice-filled couloir beneath unstable Sirac formations that are prone to unpredictable collapse and represent the most objective hazard on the route. The bottleneck concentrates the primary technical and objective risk of the upper mountain into a single section of exposed terrain beneath large overhanging ice structures. Passage through it is a known requirement for any summit attempt via the Abruzzi Spur, and is universally understood within mountaineering practice as one of the most hazardous fixed sections on K2. The morning of July 14th went smoothly. The 4 women left base camp early in the day and began climbing the lower Abruzzi Spur toward Camp 2 under clear skies and steady, predictable weather. Their pace was steady, following the timing they had already practiced during earlier acclimatization climbs. Communication was minimal, mostly short exchanges and nonverbal signals during rest stops. There were long stretches where nobody really said much at all, not because anything was wrong at that moment, but because at that altitude, even small talk starts to feel like effort you don't need to spend. At Camp 2, they briefly discussed whether to push on to Camp 3 as planned. Rachel was the one who first raised concern, pointing out how exhausted Miriam already looked, and suggesting they hold at Camp 2 a bit longer. Sonia pushed back, keeping the schedule tied to the weather window and timing constraints. The group ultimately continued, with a reassessment planned at the next stop, but the decision had already shifted in favor of moving on. Miriam had a lingering headache that didn't fully clear even after medication, and she was already needing longer breaks between sections than earlier in the day. Dana's left toes stayed numb longer than expected after the lower sections, forcing extra adjustments during stops. Sonia's altitude readings kept drifting slightly between devices, minor on their own, but persistent. Rachel was running on very little sleep and was already slower during early breaks, taking longer to recover between pitches. None of it was treated as serious on its own, but each stop was taking slightly longer than planned, and the delays were beginning to quietly accumulate without anyone explicitly addressing it. Radio contact with a nearby commercial expedition confirmed generally stable conditions on the upper mountain. The team agreed to a schedule targeting Camp 3 the following day, an overnight rest there, and a summit push beginning late on on July 15th, with an expected bottleneck passage around first light on July 16th. In practice, each of them was already carrying small issues they didn't really talk about out loud. Beneath the structure of the plan were small, unreported conditions affecting each climber. Miriam Calloway's headache had eased after medication. Dana Forsyth was experiencing persistent numbness in her left toes, attributed to cold exposure. Sonia Vreeland had noted continued inconsistencies in her altitude readings. Rachel Odom had only slept a few hours the night before. On its own, it wasn't enough to change anything. But when you put it together with the other small issues each of them was dealing with, it showed how things were already slightly off from how they planned. Just not enough for anyone to think they needed to stop or change course yet. July 15th began with stable conditions and a steady ascent from Camp 2 toward Camp 3 on the Abruzzi Spur. The team moved in a staggered formation along fixed rope sections, alternating between short technical pitches and longer exposed traverses depending on terrain. Movement was not continuous, following a cycle of climbing, clipping, resting, and re-spacing, with gaps gradually increasing as altitude and fatigue accumulated. Out of Camp 2, the route involved compact snow with intermittent ice patches, allowing relatively efficient progress. As the angle steepened, the terrain shifted into more structured, rope-assisted climbing, with climbers moving one at a time through fixed protection points while maintaining intermittent visual contact. Pace slowed, and recovery pauses between short sections became longer. Higher on the Abruzzi Spur, the surface transitioned into mixed rock bands with ice and verglav, requiring repeated adjustments in technique and equipment use. Progress became more segmented, with climbers completing shorter sections independently before regrouping at anchors. In the Black Pyramid between approximately 22,000 and 24,000 feet, conditions became more technical, with reduced friction on both rock and fixed lines, increasing the time required for secure movement. Climbers advanced individually through each protected segment, and spacing widened slightly as fatigue levels diverged. Miriam moved noticeably slower here, requiring repeated resets at transitions, which added incremental delays across multiple anchor points. Rachel, positioned below her, could track the slowdown, but had no ability to adjust pacing within the fixed rope system. After clearing the Black Pyramid, the route returned to mixed snow and ice leading toward Camp 3. Movement became more linear, but remained slowed by accumulated fatigue and altitude effects, with longer recovery pauses between sections. The team reached Camp 3 at approximately 23,950 feet around dusk, later than planned due to cumulative delays through the upper route, with worsening wind and colder conditions during the final approach, affecting both pace and rest intervals. At Camp 3, conditions and route information were reviewed, including informal notes from a prior expedition indicating deteriorating fixed rope anchors above the camp. The information was acknowledged, but did not result in a change of plan. The team proceeded with preparations for rest and the next stage of ascent. Miriam said her headache was getting worse and took medication from their shared medical kit. The others didn't really double-check her condition beyond what she told them. They tried to get some rest that night, but at that altitude, sleep was rough anyway. Above 23,000 feet, your body just doesn't recover properly, and most of them only manage light, broken sleep instead of anything solid. During the rest period, Dana Forsyth noted increased breathing effort at rest consistent with high altitude strain, but did not report it to the group. Late that night, the summit push began. The 4 women left Camp 3 and started moving up the upper Abruzzi Spur using headlamps, fixed ropes, and the route markers already set earlier in the season. It was brutally cold, with strong wind and wind chill pushing conditions right to the edge of what they had already agreed was still going territory. They kept a slow, controlled pace, the kind you use when you know you can't afford to burn energy too fast. Nobody was really thinking in full sentences at that point, more like short decisions, one section at a time. Sonia Vreeland led the way. They passed Camp 4, high camp on the shoulder, at around 26,000 feet during the early hours of the climb, without stopping, sticking to their plan of minimizing time spent that high up, where the body starts breaking down quickly. By then, they had already been climbing for hours in non-stop cold and wind, with no real breaks or proper food intake. Fatigue and the cold were clearly catching up with them. Dana Forsyth even mentioned she had completely lost feeling in her left foot below the ankle, but she still kept moving with the group as they pushed higher. At this stage, everything was stacking up: exhaustion, extreme altitude, and not enough recovery time. And it was starting to show in how each of them was functioning. Eventually, they reached the approach to the bottleneck in the early pre-dawn hours. At roughly 27,000 feet on the Abruzzi Spur, they entered the narrow couloir leading into it, where the air is so thin it's about a third of sea level oxygen. At that height, even simple decisions and movement get harder without you fully realizing it. The bottleneck is a steep, narrow ice couloir beneath unstable sérac formations. In pre-dawn conditions, it appeared as a faint, lighter corridor against the darker upper face of K2, with overhanging ice masses visible above it. At the base of the couloir, Sonja Vreeland addressed an equipment issue when her ice axe leash had frozen and could not be secured as intended. She resolved the problem by improvising an attachment using a Prusik loop from her rack, creating a functional but non-standard configuration for the tool under high-load conditions. They could see the Spanish-French team above them as small headlamp lights moving higher up the mountain. Just seeing others still going kind of pushed them forward too, like it reinforced the idea that they should keep moving as well. The fixed rope from a previous team stopped short of the top of the bottleneck, so from there on, they had to rely on their own protection and placements for the rest of the climb. They entered the bottleneck as dawn was starting to break, with the first light just beginning to show over the eastern horizon. The couloir was steep, around 45 to 55 degrees, and the ice was hard enough that every crampon step had to be placed carefully and deliberately. As visibility improved, the overhanging sérac above them came into view, a massive wall of ice sitting roughly 300 to 400 feet overhead. The rope order was Sonja leading at the top, then Miriam about 80 feet below her, followed by Rachel, with Dana bringing up the rear. Movement through this section was slow and very technical, with each climber going one at a time while staying spaced out along the fixed line. Miriam was noticeably slower here than she had been earlier on the climb. She was making more small adjustments, replacing her feet more often, and just generally moving less steadily on the terrain. Rachel, just below her, could see it happening, but didn't step in or change anything. As the light got stronger, the whole upper face opened up visually. The ice walls, the couloir, and the sérac field above them becoming much clearer as they continued upward. What followed lasted under 90 seconds. A section of the sérac field above the bottleneck, later estimated at roughly 40 feet wide and 15 feet deep, fractured and detached. The release itself was not preceded by sound, and was first perceived visually as a sudden change in the upper ice face, followed immediately by downward movement of debris into the couloir. The timing coincided with early daylight warming, a known factor in increased ice instability on exposed glacial formations. At that distance, there was no clear sense of cause or buildup, only the visible break and the immediate movement that followed it. The collapse was partial rather than a full-face failure, but the resulting icefall entered the bottleneck directly above the climbing line. As it descended, the mass broke apart further into a range of block sizes, accelerating through the steep couloir and spreading across its width. The flow of debris and secondary fragments impacted the section where the team was ascending. Sonja Vreeland, positioned highest on the rope, was struck by a large ice block and separated from the fixed line. She fell the length of the couloir to the snowfield below, a fall later estimated at several hundred meters over steep and broken terrain, with no survivable outcome. Miriam Calloway, approximately 80 feet below, was struck by secondary debris and briefly remained on the rope after the initial impact. The fixed rope system then failed at a previously reported anchor point under combined load and dynamic force, resulting in her fall down the couloir to the lower section of the slope. Rachel Odom and Dana Forsyth, positioned lower in the system, were exposed to smaller fragments and ice dust from the passing debris. Rachel's anchor system held, allowing her to remain secured on the rope. Dana's protection also held, but she lost footing during the impact sequence and was left in a compromised position on the line before regaining stability. The icefall event concluded within minutes, leaving the bottleneck section temporarily clear, but the climbing team severely disrupted and separated across the couloir and lower slope. Rachel looked down and could make out Miriam below on a rock ledge, just a dark, still shape against the ice. From that distance, it was clear she wasn't moving, and the position she was in made it obvious she hadn't landed safely on her feet. Sonia wasn't visible at all from where Rachel was standing. Farther down, the snowfield beneath the bottleneck was too distant and hazy with drifting ice dust to really see anything clearly, just a washed-out blur of whitened shadow. Above Rachel, Dana was on the rope and was not responding to calls. This lasted approximately 90 seconds, a duration that felt, in the circumstances, like much longer, before Dana's voice came back, disoriented but coherent, answering in a way that suggested she was conscious and present, but not fully processing the situation. The temperature was minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind had increased from the 22 miles per hour of the night's departure to an estimated 30 miles per hour. The two women on the rope, Rachel and Dana, were at approximately 27,000 feet without a functioning satellite phone, with a handheld radio whose range of approximately 3 miles at altitude was insufficient to reach base camp from their position, and with two of their group either missing or visible and motionless on the rock below. Rachel began descending toward Miriam. Dana followed. The descent to Miriam's position took time. Time spent unclipping and reclipping on the fixed rope. Time spent moving carefully on terrain that had just demonstrated its capacity for violence. Time spent in a cold that was getting colder as the morning progressed and the wind built. When they reached Miriam on the rock outcrop, they could see right away something was seriously wrong. Her helmet was cracked on the left side, like she'd been hit hard by something falling from above. She was still breathing, but she didn't respond when they spoke to her or tried to get her attention. Even when they touched her, there was no reaction. She wasn't moving on her own, and when Rachel checked her eyes, there was no focus or tracking, just a blank, unresponsive stare. Rachel had no medical training beyond basic first aid. Miriam, who had the training, was the one lying on the rock. The medical kit was in Miriam's pack. Rachel opened it and looked at its contents without knowing, with the certainty the situation required, what to administer, or whether administering anything would change anything. They could not carry Miriam. This is not a statement about their character or their willingness. It is a statement about physics and altitude and what the human body is capable of at 27,000 feet with the reserves they had remaining. Miriam weighed approximately 147 pounds. Her pack weighed approximately 25 additional pounds. The terrain below them required 2 functioning hands and precise footwork. An unresponsive person cannot be carried down the bottleneck couloir by 2 people in those conditions. In situations like this, it can look harsh from the outside. But when you're actually there, it's usually just the point where you realize what isn't possible anymore. They could not reach anyone. The radio produced static. The Spanish-French team's lights were visible far above, near the summit or already past it, too distant and too separated by terrain to render any useful assistance within the time frame that the situation required. So they stayed with her. On the rock outcrop at the lower margin of the bottleneck, at approximately 27,000 feet, in temperatures that were falling and wind that was building, the 2 women who were still capable of making decisions stayed with the one who was not. The hours that followed are understood only partially and by inference. Hypothermia at extreme altitude does not announce itself with a single moment. It is a process, a gradual withdrawal of function that begins with the hands and feet, progresses to the core, and eventually impairs the cognitive processes that might otherwise prompt a person to act in their own survival interest. At the temperature and wind chill conditions on the bottleneck on the morning of July the 16th, 2016, a stationary person without continued calorie intake and with compromised circulatory reserves from hours of extreme exertion would begin experiencing the early stages of hypothermia within minutes of stopping movement. Miriam Calloway died later that morning, based on a medical review after the incident. The cause was a combination of the head injury from the falling debris and the gradual effects of hypothermia after the fall. She never regained consciousness after Rachel and Dana reached her. There was nothing to suggest she was aware of their presence. Whatever her final hours were like, she wasn't alone. At some point after Miriam's death, the precise timing is not known, Rachel and Dana made the decision to attempt descent. This decision required leaving Miriam's body on the rock outcrop, which is the kind of decision that mountaineering experience prepares you for intellectually, and that nothing prepares you for in practice. They made it anyway. because the alternative was to remain in place until they also died. Dana's left foot was severely frostbitten by this point. The numbness that had begun at Camp 4 had progressed through the hours of stationary exposure on the outcrop to tissue damage that was no longer reversible with rewarming. Rachel's hands were frostbitten as well, though the degree would only be fully assessed later. Both women were hypoxic, physically depleted, and grieving in the particular way that is only possible when the grief is happening at the same time as the emergency that caused it. With no interval for processing, they began to descend. The descent of the bottleneck by two frostbitten, hypoxic, exhausted women, one of whom had lost most of the sensory function in her dominant lower foot, was not the clean technical exercise that the ascent had been. Fixed rope sections that had been manageable on the way up presented different challenges on the way down, particularly at the point approximately 1,200 feet below the rock outcrop, where the fixed rope section ended abruptly in a location that required the climber to transfer from the rope to self-placed protection, or to downclimb unprotected terrain. On the way up, everything is about gaining ground. On the way down, it's about not losing it faster than you can control. Dana reached this transition point. The record of what happened next comes from the Spanish-French team's guide, who was by this time descending from the summit and had a view of the upper Abruzzi spur from above. He observed a figure, later confirmed to be Dana based on the description of her equipment and position, moving at the transition point where the fixed rope ended. He observed the figure step off the rope section onto the unprotected terrain below. He observed the figure fall. The fall was about 1,200 feet. Dana didn't manage to stop it at any point. The guide watching from a distance said it didn't look like she tried to self-arrest at all, but it's not really clear why. It could have been that she was too exhausted or physically unable at that point, or that everything happened too fast to react, or that the numbness in her left foot meant she just couldn't get proper grip with her crampons to even set up a self-arrest position. She came to rest on the lower Abruzzi spur approximately 400 feet below the lower bottleneck. The guide confirmed there was no movement after she stopped. Rachel continued descending alone. According to the Spanish-French guide, who was the only outside witness to her final hours, he later saw a single figure moving slowly down the lower Abruzzi spur beneath Camp 3 during the afternoon. The movement was uneven, with long pauses in between, like she had to stop often just to keep going. He was descending above and behind, and when he reached that section of the route several hours later, there was no one there. The snowfield showed signs of a sitting rest position, the kind of impression left when a person sits down in the snow for a period of time, and a small area of disturbed snow, consistent with either a controlled lie down or an uncontrolled collapse or fall. No body was visible in the immediate area. No tracks continued downward from the rest impression. Rachel Odom was not seen again. The Spanish-French team's guide reached base camp on the evening of July 16th and reported the incident to Pakistani authorities. A high-altitude rescue team was deployed the following morning, but operations were halted on July 17th when winds on the upper mountain exceeded 50 miles per hour, making access above base camp unsafe. The team remained on standby for approximately 38 hours until conditions improved. A partial search on July 18th confirmed the recovery of Sonia Vreeland, Dana Forsyth, and Miriam Calloway at different points along the Abruzzi Spur and Bottleneck route. Rachel Odom was not located during the initial operation. A secondary search in August 2016 recovered remains consistent with Rachel Odom at approximately 21,000 feet in a crevasse field, later confirmed through DNA testing. Official findings issued in November 2016 listed causes of death as blunt force trauma from fall impacts for Sonia Vreeland and Dana Forsyth, traumatic injury with secondary hypothermia for Miriam Calloway, and hypothermia with exhaustion for Rachel Odom.